Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Tokyo College for a very special symposium titled World Literature in Translation, Book Launch, The Bankruptcy. My name is Shannon Welch, and I am delighted to be today's moderator, not only because I am conducting literary research as a project researcher here at Tokyo College, but also because Cinthia is a friend of mine. Before we begin, I just wanted to share the program for today's event. First, we'll hear a talk from each of our 7 speakers, although the co-translators will be presenting together. Then we will begin a discussion amongst the panelists in which they will ask questions and share comments with one another before we conclude the event with a Q&A. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit your questions, and feel free to do so throughout their talks, since they hope to incorporate some of the questions into their discussion. Now to start. We're here today to celebrate the recent publication of Cintia Kozonoi VEZZANI and Jason Rhys Parry's translation of Brazilian author Júlia Lopes de Almeida's novel, The Bankruptcy, edited by Ana Cláudia SURIANI da Silva and published by University College London Press. This translation, which won the English Pen Award for Translation, introduces to the English-speaking world one of the most important Brazilian writers of the 19th century and her astute ability to represent Brazilian society around the turn of the century from a perceptive and critical perspective. We are very fortunate to have panels join us today from all over the world: Brazil, the UK, France, Japan. Not only do they include the book's translators and editor, but also professors and scholars of literature, translation, and Brazilian studies. Together, they will be discussing the state of world literature today and the role that translation plays in shaping its development, as well as approaches to translation. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speakers, Cintia Kozonoi VEZZANI and Jason Rhys Parry. Cintia is currently a postdoctoral fellow with us here at Tokyo College, working on an interdisciplinary project that innovatively brings together the fields of literature and neuroscience. Prior to this appointment, Cintia received her PhD in Spanish and Portuguese from Northwestern University. Jason is the Senior Content Manager of Research and Development at Sapienship, a multidisciplinary organization advocating for global responsibility. Recently, his writing has been published in Theory and Event, Diacritics and Log, and Real Life magazine. Please join me in welcoming Cintia and Jason.
Yes, let me begin by thanking Shannon for her work organizing this event and the panelists for their generosity in joining us all the way from São Paulo, London, Paris, Tokyo, and beyond. I would also like to thank English Pen for recognizing this work with the Translates Award, UCL Press for their editorial support, and Tokyo College for hosting this book launch. I also want to thank each person watching this event. Arigatou gozaimasu. Muito obrigada. Great it is to open the symposium on world literature, an event that is part of the Tokyo College's research theme, The World and Humanities in 2050, surrounded by speakers from a variety of cities all over the world, and who conduct research in Lusophone, German, Japanese, literature, philosophy, and film studies. Time difference did not stop us from coming together in front of this screen to celebrate the first novel-length translation of Júlia Lopes de Almeida's The Bankruptcy. Together with Jason Parry, we explain in the preface of the novel that part of the significance of translation is its capacity to make a work written in one language available to an entirely new audience. But another part of translation's power is its ability to bend a language into new shapes, to stretch a grammar and syntax into strange and novel forms. In translating The Bankruptcy, we have attempted to walk a tightrope between these two extremes, making the text accessible and enjoyable for a new readership, while at the same time leaving hints as to the vast gulf separating today's readers from the time and place in which Almeida's novel first appeared. Now, allow me to transform this reflection on translation into a metaphor. It is dinner time in Japan, lunch time in Europe, and breakfast time in Brazil, the places where today's speakers are joining us from. They wonder, how many of you and how many of the audience have had or will have a cup of coffee? You may choose the beans according to your taste, and no matter how different they might be in aroma, strength, color, and way of being served, the experience of drinking coffee connects us all. In this sense, Almeida's novel is like a cup of coffee. In Portuguese, it will taste differently than in English, but it also allows those who do not have access to the Portuguese language or to Brazilian beans to have a sip of Almeida's prose. Indeed, coffee itself is the foundation of the novel's plot. Its setting is the coffee export boom of the late 19th century. I believe that part of the celebratory event should be an invitation for the audience to read the Bankruptcy. So please, and just to clarify, if we were all together, I would even offer a cup of coffee to all of you. So I would ask you to drink a cup wherever you are, and while you taste it, think about the opening of this novel that was published in 1901. I will read the first paragraphs in Portuguese, so that those of you who do not understand the language can simply enjoy the melody of its words and phrases. Jason then will read the English translation, and we already thank the Japanese interpreters for making Almeida accessible to the Japanese audience. The Bankruptcy, or A Falência, begins like this. O Rio de Janeiro ardia sob o sol de dezembro, que escaldava as pedras, bafejando ar de fornalha na atmosfera. Toda a rua de São Bento, atravancada por veículos pesadões estrepitosos, cheirava a café cru. Era hora de trabalho. Entre o fragor das ferragens sacudidas, o giro ameaçador das rodas e os coscorvos de animais contidos por mãos brutas, o povo negrejava suando, compacto, esbaforido. A porta do armazém de Francisco Teodoro era, nesse dia, grande o movimento. Um carroceiro, em pé dentro do caminhão, onde ajeitava sacas, gritava zangado, voltando-se para o fundo negro da casa. Andem com isso, que às 11 horas tenho de estar nas docas.
Thank you, Cintia. And it falls to me to read the English version, available as a free download at UCL Press or from your favorite online bookseller. And the English version begins like this. I'll just read the first 2 pages. Chapter 1. Rio de Janeiro burned under the December sun, and an oven-hot air spread through the atmosphere, scalding the cobblestones. The entirety of Rua São Bento was congested with heavy, clattering wagons, smelling of raw coffee. It was the working hour. Amid the clamor of horseshoes, the alarming rush of wheels, and the skittish movements of animals yanked still by coarse hands, the people on the street darkened with sweat, crushed and breathless. That day, on the doorstep of Francisco Teodora's warehouse, there was a great commotion. A driver, organizing sacks on his wagon, shouted angrily, turning to the dark interior of the warehouse, "Move along now, I must be at the harbor by 11. And the porters came, following one another at a fantastic pace, tossing the sacks atop the wagon, raising at each throw a cloud of dust that enveloped them. Some were white men, with hairy chests, barely covered by filthy, wrinkled cotton shirts. Others were black, naked from the waist up, chests shining with sweat and eyes bulging. The smell of coffee mixed with the damp scent of those moving bodies, whose blood pulsed visibly in the swollen veins of their necks and arms. In the desperate hurry, the irate driver cursed furiously at the others who passed too close, scraping the sides of his wagon weighed down with burlap sacks, raising a cloud of dust that they all inhaled together. The others responded in the same improper manner. Meanwhile, the Tilbury drivers in their gridlocked lane listened and laughed, chewing on their cigarettes. The porters zigzagged in the middle of it all like ants on the march, their heads curved by the weight of their bags, elbowing their straining bodies past the donkeys' glossy rumps. Every now and then, pedestrians quickly retreated inside one open door or another, for fear of being smashed by the wheels that invaded the pavements and noisily skidded over the cobblestone street. Here and there, old black women, their white kerchiefs tied into caps over their curly hair, swept gaily and swiftly at the spilled coffee beans with brooms made of palm leaves. With the same speed, they sifted them in small bowls made of thin sheets of metal held together with nails. That was their business, which in those days of abundance produced so much prosperity. They enriched themselves with the leftovers. Throughout the entire street, all one could see were gesticulating arms and moving legs. The mixing voices shared gossip, laughing with the same triumph, moaning with the same effort in a noisy and inharmonious orchestra. Excepting the African women collecting coffee and some Italian women who dared to leave the burlap factory carrying dozens of sacks upon their heads, no other women stepped on those cobblestones, more accustomed to the weight of ill-mannered brutes. There, virile force dominated, physical strength, moved by iron muscles and flexed chests intent on wringing a tough living out of life. These athletic bodies, these echoing voices that resounded like the strident trumpets of war, gave to the old street the same pulse that fresh young blood gives to an artery flowing with impulsive vigor. The heat wave was already arriving from the other streets in panting heaves. It came from the Rua dos Benedictinos and from the warehouses along Rua Municipal, bursting with coffee. The warehouses emptied out their riches towards the hangars and the docks, only to greedily fill themselves again as if they were famished. In a few doorways, workers sat down to rest a moment, their elbows stuck to raised knees, chewing the leaves of their cigarettes, tasting the smoke, looking with indifference at the rushing multitude that, by means fair or foul, made their way through life in a whirlwind of dust and shouts. Sometimes a group of young boys, mostly Italians, emerged from the street corners to roam the blocks, laughing out loud, filling up their pockets with the old African women's spare beans, whose cries of complaint were drowned out in the dense din of the street. Inside the buildings, there was the same mad dash. So perhaps as a way of opening this conversation about world literature and translation today, I can just quickly summarize my first impressions when I read this passage. When I read it for the first time, the thing that really jumped out to me was its cinematic quality. I could imagine this whole scene, and indeed the entire first chapter, being filmed in a long single take, a take like those you find in some films by Andrei Tarkovsky or Alfonso Cuarón. And an interesting thing about those films is that at times the camera seems to have a mind of its own and interests of its own that do not always coincide with moving the plot forward. And at times in Almeida's novel, the narrator also seems less interested in ushering us through a sequence of events than in sitting and absorbing some facet of this fictional world that it has built, pausing to admire some workers on a march or a glistening nebula of dust. So if anyone has connections at Netflix, I think the Bankruptcy richly deserves a miniseries adaptation. It has real potential. But there are two things that I think such an adaptation would struggle to convey. And these two things, I think, say something about what literature is and what literature can do. And one of those things, strangely enough, is smell. In cinema, you can see characters react to smells. But in Almeida's novel, the characters are immersed in this world of scent. Everyone is wrapped in this cloak of fragrance and odor, and this shapes the plot in fundamental ways. Flowers manipulate the characters as surely as they do bees and butterflies. And the second quality that an adaptation would struggle to convey is the diffuse agency that saturates Almeida's world, that animates so many objects in Almeida's world. The breeze is a living thing in her book. It pants and heaves, and the warehouses are these writhing pits, swallowing people and regurgitating coffee and capital. Almeida's characters live in a world filled with unpredictable objects, even as they themselves are subject to all too predictable temptations. And this inversion, I think, is very telling. And so what this novel does, and maybe what the best literature does, is teach us to see these dynamics, to see planetary flows in a cup of coffee, or everyday envy in a spectacular stock market crash. And I like to think about Almeida walking along the street described in this passage that I've just read. This woman, an upstanding wife and mother of bourgeois extraction, strolling down amidst the dust and the dirt and the noise, and gathering all these details, and then writing them down for later. And we can ask, why would she do that? Why would she put herself through that? And I think the answer is that in doing so, she's teaching us how to look, right? She's teaching us a way of looking at the world, which is perhaps another way of saying she's teaching us a way of living in the world. Perhaps this way of looking at the world is also a way of living in the world. And perhaps that's what world literature does. So thank you all very much for coming. And that's me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jason and Cynthia, for starting us off with such inspiring words and for giving us a little taste of Almeida's beautiful, beautiful prose. So next we have the book's editor, Ana Cláudia SURIANI da Silva, who is also an associate professor of Brazilian studies at the University College London. Her research on Brazilian literature, book and press histories, Machado de Assis, and fashion history has been recognized widely, as she has won the Brazilian Foreign Ministry International Award for Best Essays on Machado de Assis and is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. She is also working on editing 2 series of chronicles by Júlia Lopes de Almeida, A Moda from 1892 to 1901, and Dois Pedaços de Prosa from 1907 to 1912, published in the newspaper O País from 1884 to 1934. So thank you, Ana Cláudia SURIANI da Silva. I'll now hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Shannon, for the introduction. You cannot imagine how happy and proud at the same time I am to be involved in this collective effort to establish a place for Júlia Lopes de Almeida in world literature through the publication of her most important novel, The Bankruptcy. I would like to thank UCL Press, my colleagues and editors, co-editors in the series Literature and Translation, Tim Matthews, Geraldine Brody. I would also like to thank Chris Penfold, Pen Translate, for making this project come true. And of course, the translators, Cintia and Jason, without whom nothing would have happened. But above all, I would like to thank my students because this project was born from a demand from my first year undergraduate students to have a 19th century author, a 19th century Brazilian woman writer in my Brazilian novel module. And of course, it was no-brainer to choose Júlia Lopes de Almeida. I'm going to share my slides now. Let me just, okay, there you go. So it was a no-brainer to choose Júlia Lopes de Almeida. Júlia Lopes de Almeida published 10 novels, hundreds of short stories and chronicas, plays, poems, children's books, and manuals for ladies, which sensitively rendered the experience of women during one of Brazil's most turbulent historical periods. She was an active intellectual figure, a prominent literary voice who advocated in her fictional and non-fictional work for modernized gender roles, access to education, and women's suffrage. In parallel to advocating for women's rights, Júlia also fulfilled gender expectations by guiding women on fashion issues and how to succeed in domestic life in her newspaper columns, which she published under the pseudonyms Escila Worms and Dona Júlia. She participated actively in the foundation of the Academy of Brazilian of Letters and was considered for the inaugural list of members in 1896. However, her name was excluded because she was a woman and she was replaced by that of her husband, the Portuguese poet Filinto de Almeida, as a sort of compensation, since she had already been informed about her nomination. Júlia received an extensive and liberal education. Her parents, who were Portuguese, moved to Rio de Janeiro in 1857 and opened a secondary school on Rua do Lavradio, where Júlia was born. Her parents moved frequently, so the young Júlia lived in Petrópolis, Montevideo, and spent most of her youth in Campinas, in the interior of São Paulo. It was in Campinas that she started to publish newspaper columns. Her first newspaper column was published in the local newspaper, Gazeta de Campinas, in 1881, encouraged by her father. And from there onward, she became a regular contributor to the local press. She lived in Lisbon as well with her family between 1886 and 1888. And she married her husband, Filinto, in Lisbon. And upon returning into Brazil in 1888, the couple settled in Rio de Janeiro, where their first son was born. So Júlia began to document in her writing the ongoing transformations in Brazilian society at the end of the 19th century, the abolition of slavery, the end of the Brazilian Empire, and the flurry of technological and social transformations that rendered the Rio de Janeiro. She was born in a unrecognizable city from the one she passed away in 1934. She died when she was 71 years old. So Júlia started to write during a period of great cultural, social, and urban transformations, which culminated in the Brazilian Belle Époque, which went from roughly 1898 to 1914. So the Belle Époque was a time of optimism and belief in progress, which was marked by technological innovations and artistic creativity. During this time, Brazil was trying to emerge from the shadow of colonialism and slavery, and the elites were eager to position the country as a beacon of modernity. As Brazil sought closer ties with the Western countries and embraced European culture standards, Rio de Janeiro underwent significant urban reforms inspired by Haussmann's urban reforms in Paris. Old tenements were demolished, making way for the Avenida Central, which is now Rio Branco, a wide and well-lit avenue filled with eclectic style buildings. This transformation aimed to turn Rio de Janeiro into a showcase of Brazilian progress. But at the beginning of the 20th century, Rio de Janeiro was far from its current reputation as the wonderful city. It was often called the city of death due to rampant diseases, poor sanitation, and a lack of hygiene. The city's narrow streets were cluttered with pé de bois stores, which sold groceries in crowded, uninviting environments. Women rarely ventured out except to go to church, with the exception of Rua do Ouvidor, which we saw in one of the slides before, a street known for its high-end clothing and accessories primarily sold by European businessmen and women. While these reforms brought elements of progress, they were often implemented at the expense of marginalized communities, leading to the forced removal and displacement of thousands of residents. The urban landscape, this urban landscape that you can see through the slides reflected these contrasts with opulent neighborhoods, gardens, beautiful women dressed according to French fashion, juxtaposed against overcrowded and unsanitary slums. Rio de Janeiro's early 20th century history encapsulates the complex interplay of progress and inequality that continues to shape the city's identity today. So Júlia Lopes de Almeida is part of a generation of writers that includes João do Rio, Lima Barreto, and Carmen Dolores, who depicted the social and cultural changes in the late 19th century Brazil. However, the world of letters was essentially a male-dominated sphere, marked by competition and rivalry, and established its own instances of consecration and legitimation. Júlia Lopes de Almeida was one of the very few women writers to achieve critical as well as commercial success, and to carve a niche for herself as an intellectual woman. She excelled as a fashion columnist, as a children's writer, and continued to write novels and short stories that gained prominence, with The Bankruptcy, published in 1901, making a significant turning point in her career. Júlia was instrumental in hosting the Salão Verde, a gathering of intellectuals at her home. You can see a picture of her home in Santa Teresa here, where prominent writers, politicians, and artists met. She also broke barriers by becoming one of the first women to deliver lectures in Brazil. In June 1931, she reflected on the advances of the feminist movement driven by the work of the Brazilian Federation of Women's Progress. She was invited to deliver the opening speech at the Second International Feminist Congress held in Rio de Janeiro in 1931, so 3 years before her death. So this is one of the photos of her lectures. The one on the left is of the lecture for the Feminist Congress held in Rio de Janeiro in 1931. So I'm going to quote Júlia Lopes in this lecture. I come from another century. I have an ancient soul, which I do not deny is still attached to the odd prejudice, like wisps of cloud on bare cliffs. But I understand the present and fully applaud all the initiatives that lean towards supporting and improving future societies. Those who have known how to grow old know how the expressions of things and beings change with the passing of days. We cannot be today what we were yesterday, just as we will not be tomorrow what we are now. In 1934, Júlia Lopes de Almeida visited Luanda in what is now Angola to visit her daughter who was ill. Tragically, she contracted malaria and passed away in Rio de Janeiro 8 days after her return. The life and work of Júlia Lopes de Almeida are a testament to her talent as a writer and her ability to challenge the gender norms of her time. She paved the way for women in the literary world in Brazil and contributed to the discussion of fashion and feminism in a crucial period of Brazilian history. Thank you. I'm going now to stop sharing the video. Sorry, not the video, the slides.
Thank you so much, Professor Da Silva, for sharing this very important context surrounding Almeida and the novel. I would now like to welcome Maite CONDE, who is a professor in Brazilian Studies and Visual Culture at the University of Cambridge. Dr. CONDE's research focuses on Brazilian culture, especially cinema, and her books, Foundational Films, Early Cinema and Modernity in Brazil, and Consuming Visions, Cinema, Writing and Modernity in Rio de Janeiro, have won numerous awards, including the Andrew Mellon MLA Award and the Catherine Singer Kovacs Prize. So I'll now hand it over to you, Dr. CONDE.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Shannon, for your introduction. And a big thank you as well to Cintia and Jason for inviting me to take part in the launch. And a huge congratulations on an excellent translation. It's really good. And congratulations as well, parabéns to Ana Cláudia for the book series. It's so exciting and so important to have this book. So thank you. Right, I'm going to share my screen as well. And hopefully this will work, yeah. Cintia asked me or suggested that I speak about the context of Almeida's novel, particularly the social and political context and the urban context, some of which Ana Cláudia pointed towards. I'm going to do this by departing from the title of the book that Cintia and Jason translated, The Bankruptcy. Now, the title clearly refers to the novel's narrative events, the financial ruin of the wealthy coffee exporter Francisco Teodoro, who decides to gamble his accumulated wealth on the stock market. This narrative, as the introduction by Cintia, Jason, and Ana Cláudia notes, articulates the real events of Brazil's first financial crisis, known as the encilhamento, which literally means saddling up. Now, while published in 1901, Almeida's novel, The Bankruptcy, is set during the early years of the First Republic, which began a year after the abolition of slavery in 1888. That transition from empire to republic, the transition that Ana Cláudia mentioned, saw a boom in Brazil's coffee market, which Cintia and Jason referred to, and also a new monetary policy. So to attract immigrants and foreign interest, the country adopted, or the new regime, or the old regime actually, adopted a policy of unrestricted credit for investment, backed by an abundant issuance of money. This process led to the ascendancy of the stock market and a period of inflation, investment, and frenzied speculation. The stock market boom, however, was fictitious. It thrived on the uninhibited printing of inconvertible paper money and the invention of fake companies. When this house of cards collapsed in 1892, it buried the economy. So Almeida's story of Teodoro's bankruptcy is then, and it presents us with a speculative fiction, one that sheds light on the transformation of Brazil as it sought to participate in the global landscape of capitalism's exchange economy. Detailing this change, a contemporary chronicler, Hippie, noted, the stock market is the photography of our society. That's the end of his quote. Now, by focusing on the stock market, Almeida's naturalist novel offers us a snapshot of Brazil's modernization built on an unrestrained and promiscuous capitalism. This financial promiscuity is figured in the novel by sexual promiscuity, as its key protagonists engage in adultery, including Teodoro. Yet the patriarch's downfall here is not his sexual appetite, but his appetite for wealth, his greed for extravagance, for possession, waste, ostentation, triumph, all of which are unleashed by the economic agitations of the period. These same agitations precipitated the emergence and arrival of arrivistas, or homens novos, a class of nouveau riche. Historian Nicolas Savchenko notes that the encilhamento led, and I quote him, to an Olympic consecration of an aggressive arrivismo, social climbing, under the pretext of democracy and the triumph of a fearless corruption in the name of equal opportunities, and I end the quote. So this new class is represented in our novel, The Bankruptcy, by the significantly absent Gama Torres, a modern businessman who's quickly made a fortune on the stock market. In his desire to be richer than Torres, Teodoro abandons his traditional business practices and succumbs to the seductions of the stock market and ultimately loses everything. In Almeida's novel, then, the stock market is symptomatic of capitalist economy's vaporousness, which is not grounded and can quickly move from boom to bust. The transitional moment the novel maps thus allows us to see how the sovereignty of the Republic was allied to the sovereignty of the market, and how it marked a moment of capital flight. Built on future speculation, capital disengaged from the traditional practices of production, undergirded by land ownership, so central to abolition and slavery. Here, the novel draws attention to how this transition initiated a process of dematerialization that abstracted traditional labor from value. As Marx famously put it, all that's solid melts into the air. Indeed, the opening carefully details the extensive hard physical labor involved in Teodoro's traditional coffee business, with the stifling heat, and we heard this in the opening, stifling heat underscoring the heavy work involved in all processes of production, from carrying the sacks to keeping the books. All of this is then lost to the market. It evaporates. As Almeida's novel indicates, these abstractions have material effects on society and on individuals, resulting in material and moral bankruptcy and economic and emotional precarity. Right, it's significant that all of this takes place in Brazil's then capital, Rio de Janeiro. The transformative years of the novel setting, as Ana Cláudia said, saw the dramatic transformation of Rio. It was during this period that the city witnessed the rapid accumulation of vast resources rooted mainly in commerce and finance. Consequently, it became the country's commercial and economic center, home to the Bank of Brazil, to national and foreign banks, and to the stock exchange seen here. I found, while I was doing research for this, I found this as well. It's a stereoscope of the stock exchange, which tells you how much finance became part of popular culture and money was. And I think Almeida kind of articulates that and responds to it. Now, the influx of foreign finance in the city was matched by the increasing presence of foreign goods. Cariocas, or at least elite Cariocas, were able to purchase goods, fashion, foods, household items from abroad, transforming Rio into a cosmopolitan city. The democratization of credit, impelled by the encilhamento, gave rise to a city in which some people could refashion themselves, with the Republic's financial ideology prompting a makeover of the city and its inhabitants. A fever of consumption took hold of the city's elite, which became geared towards novelty and the desire for the latest fashion. Key here was the street that Ana Cláudia mentioned, Rua do Ouvidor. So on this very small street in the heart of Rio, that foreign merchants took root, introducing luxury commerce into the capital. The Ouvidor was home to bookshops, to tailors, to milliners, and department stores that sold the latest fashions. Journalists praised the street for the variety of luxury goods it offered. In 1890, a journalist wrote, "The Ouvidor shines and exalts. Its commerce ranges from ostentation of luxury to variety." So with its seductive display of luxury products, the Ouvidor was a primordial landscape of commerce and consumption, a manifestation of the expanding market of commodification in the country's capital. It was on this street that the elite would satiate their desires for the latest novelty, and where they would also promenade their latest fashions. Now, the Ouvidor makes a few appearances in Almeida's novel, 3 to be precise. Significantly, it's on this street of commercial desires that Teodora's wife, Camila, and her lover, Gervasio, promenade, and also where Gervasio spies his adulterous wife. Yet the Ouvidor is not the only urban location in the novel. The Bankruptcy travels different sites of Rio, alternating between mansions in Botafogo, coffee warehouses, and urban docks. It also takes us to the winding streets of the city centre. Now, many of these streets no longer exist, as Ana Cláudia mentioned. In the desire for novelty and to exhibit its modernity and cosmopolitanism, Rio underwent its own refashioning known as the Bota Abaixo. Starting in 1902, its colonial architecture and structures were raised and replaced with a new topography, one that was modelled on Paris. Old streets were widened, parks redesigned, and new boulevards constructed. The city's new centrepiece was the street that Ana Cláudia mentioned, Avenida Central, seen here, 1906, which is the year that the new centre was inaugurated. A grand thoroughfare, Avenida Central, was, and I quote Savchenko here, conceived as a concourse of facades, providing the city with beaux art decor in ivory and crystal, combined with elegant lamps of modern electric illumination and lights from the windows of fine shops with imported goods. So grandiose buildings lined the avenue, making it what historian Jeffrey Nidell calls a showcase. This word, a showcase, is important, I think, and it emphasizes a superficiality to Rio's new physiognomy and its monumental buildings, as if it was devoid of substance. And this is something that contemporary author Lima Barreto stated, describing the new city as a stage set. This superficiality was part of the city's construction. Rio's reforms had speculative foundations. Built on credit, the Bota Abaixo was an attempt to lure immigrants and overseas investment and commerce to stimulate profit for the country's modernization. As a commentator at the time noted, Rio's transformation is, and he said, I quote, undeniable and an immediate necessity in our economy, end of quote. The city was floated on the stock market as a commodity intended to attract the desires of foreign investors. Despite the superficiality of this strategy, it can be considered successful. Immigration increased and foreign investment soared. Foreign commercial and infrastructural firms also escalated in Rio after its reforms, most of them located here on Avenida Central. Indeed, here, this is what was at the time called the Caixa de Amortização, kind of a debt place. It later became the Central Bank of Brazil. Right, this suggests that the city was magically materialized by the investment it sought, with its material foundations emanating from future speculation. Rio's refashioning was thus the result of a gamble, showing us how the crash in 1893 didn't end the speculative practices of the encilhamento, but became rather part of the country's foundations, modern foundations. It's significant that the novel ends, I think, in a small house in the aptly named Bom Sucesso, a working class suburb in Rio's north. Abandoned and let down by the speculations of all the men in her life, including her own son, Teodora's widow, Camila, directs her attentions to a new future embodied by her daughters. She invested in this future by educating her daughters, providing them with the tools to be independent. This ending clearly keys into the growing feminist movement that, as Ana Cláudia mentioned, Ana Almeida was involved in. It also provides an alternative to the foundations the Republic had forged for modern Brazil, one that the novel's narrative has discredited as vaporous and volatile. All of this underscores how Almeida, our author, was not just engaged in the context of a feminist struggle in Brazil, she was engaged in the social and political context itself. Hers was, to use Shevchenko's term, a literatura como missão, writing as a mission. Far from adopting the excessively ornamental forms of writing in fashion at the time, where words themselves seemed subject to inflation, Almeida's stock market novel presents us with, to use the chronicler's words, a photograph of Brazilian society's transition to modernity. It shows and denounces its disintegration as the Republic succumbs to the desires of a get-rich-quick ethos built on the vagaries of global capitalist exchange economy. I think that's...
Thank you so much, Dr. Conde, for sharing that really insightful presentation. So our next speaker is Vitor SOSTER, a PhD student in literary theory at the State University of Campinas, Brazil, who Cintia and Jason both mentioned in the book's preface was an important collaborator on their translation project. His research interests include cinematographic language, literary theory, and cultural criticism. Sorry, that's a hard word to say. Thank you so much, Vitor, for joining us today all the way from Brazil. I'll hand the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Shannon. Let me just share my screen before I start my presentation here. Okay, all right. So, well, good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I would like to start thanking Cintia and Jason for the invitation to participate in this book launch, to Shannon for such a welcoming reception, and to Tokyo College for promoting this event. I also want to greet the professors who are sharing the knowledge in this symposium. It has been a pleasure to meet you. Besides, it is great to see the Bankruptcy, one of Júlia Lopes de Almeida's main novels, expanding its audience thanks to the publication of its translation to English. Originally published in 1901, the novel spent a great deal of time invisible to Brazilian readers, despite its literary merits. Fortunately, the strengthening of the feminist movement, along with so many other social changes in the 21st century, led to the book rediscovery, culminating in its republication in 2019. And its inclusion between the years of 2020 and 2023, the mandatory reading list for the entry exam at the State University of Campinas, better known as Unicamp, one of the main higher education institutions in Brazil. That inclusion ended up spreading the book among high school students and literature teachers who, like me, a young literature teacher myself, had no notice of the novel before. The path taken by the Bankruptcy suggests a reflection on the roles that criticism and education play on which literary works remain popular and how they do. If on one side, between the 19th and 20th centuries, Brazilian criticism expended effort in selecting works for the purpose of the construction of a national identity, school syllabuses still tend to reproduce those assumptions, not so much as a lively engagement with a nationalist project or out of any social concern, but more as a compromise, out of a need to cover a set of well-established texts that will serve as the content for external assessments. As we might expect, that approach doesn't lead students to a literary experience, making the teaching of literature a matter of concern. At a certain point in Hannah Arendt's essay on crisis in education, published in 1954, referring to parents, but I would also extend her comments to teachers, she says, education, they assume responsibility for both, for the life and development of the child, and for the continuance of the world. But then one can ask, what is this world like to which we contribute in giving continuance? One can realize the possibility of acting through the crevices of what is given, helping in continuing what is worthy of continuance and changing what should be changed, especially in terms of the inequalities that dominate the Brazilian reality. In any case, whether or not we are aware of it, our actions upon the world are always guided by certain principles, including theoretical ones. This issue becomes particularly acute when we deal with literary works. Fábio Durão, a professor of literature at Unicamp, reminds us that a recent and growing perspective in the literary studies is that there is not such thing which is obviously literary. Seen from this perspective, what can be understood as literary is a matter of constant scrutiny and debate. Yet, in search of parameters to conceive a view of what literature is all about, I refer to one of the main Brazilian literary critics, Professor Antônio Cândido, who used to consider the literary experience as a relationship between authors, works, and readers. However, as Arnaldo Franco Jr., a professor of literature at Unesp, another major university in Brazil, warns us, criticism has often put too much emphasis on just one of those three elements, which has problematic consequences for the teaching of literature. Critics tend to only emphasize the authors, works, or readers, rarely considering all elements of the literary experience together. If emphasis falls only on authors, teaching literature becomes a synonym for focusing on the author's biographies, their intentions, and how they reproduced characteristics of literary periods. And speaking of this, such a tendency is one of the reasons why the Bankruptcy spent almost a century forgotten. Since the novel was written by a female author, it had been labeled as a minor literary work for many decades. Besides, in educational terms, if studying literature means only studying authors and what surrounds them, actually reading their works becomes secondary. However, if emphasis falls just on the works, this is also a problem. While on one hand, this is the essence of our work as teachers of literature, on the other hand, if teaching literature means just teaching students to identify structural features, one can miss the social meaning of literature, which is once again evident, for instance, when it comes to the reading of Almeida's novel. Treating the novel as a self-contained phenomenon strips it of its social significance. At least, if emphasis falls just on the reader, teaching literature becomes emptied of any objectivity, just relying on subjective impressions. Of course, starting from the student's impressions can be valuable as a way of bringing pupils closer to literature. But the aesthetic experience offered by a novel, for example, can go far beyond that. Usually, due to the nature of the entrance exams for universities, school teaching tends to start with the reader's impressions, then move to pre-established content related to the author, and then to the work. Yet, could that be all that concerns the teaching of literature? Durão argues that the literary is not configured as a repository of fixed content, nor as emptiness to be fulfilled with subjective dispositions, but as an event. And nowadays, the best place for it is the classroom. Despite institutional struggles, teachers can guide students to reading literature as an active manner of dealing with the outside world from the inside of language. For that purpose, developing practices of elaborating interpretive hypotheses and building supportive arguments are vital. In a world where students and teachers are immersed in media, in a continuous flow of images ready for consumption, literature classes can be a breath of fresh air for thinking critically. On reflecting about literature, Marilena Chauí, one of the most prominent Brazilian philosophers, affirms that writers do not invite the ones who read them to re-encounter what was already known, but they touch on existent meanings to make them dissonant. And thanks to that estrangement, create a new harmony that will seize the readers. It is through the power of intriguing readers in a non-utilitarian fashion that literature reveals itself as a source for thought. It is through putting students in contact with the literariness of works, which does not limit itself to literature, but is extended to other artistic languages such as painting, music, and cinema, that literature classes promote what is truthfully human. By those terms, I refer once again to Cândido in his famous essay, The Right to Literature. Getting in touch with the humanizing power of literature means being able to reflect, acquire knowledge, be critical about the world's state of affairs, and be empathetic to the ones around us and those that are far from us through reading. Similarly, when it comes to translations, such as the one that is being launched today, teaching literature helps with the building of bridges, promoting a more humanized world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vitor. As an aspiring teacher myself, I found everything you had to say really inspiring and very thought-provoking. So thank you very much for sharing it.
You're welcome.
So another integral collaborator on this translation project is our next speaker, Samuel Weber. Dr. Weber is an Avalon Foundation Professor of the Humanities at Northwestern University and is co-director of Northwestern's Paris program in critical theory. Not only has his co-translation of Theodore Adorno's Prisms helped define how this work of the Frankfurt School is understood in English, but also he has continued to provide pioneering scholarship on Balzac, Lacan, Freud, and Benjamin. Thank you so much, Dr. Weber, for joining us today. I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Shannon. And above all, thank you, Cintia and Jason, for inviting me to participate in this roundtable on translation, celebrating the publication of your translation of the Bankruptcy, which, as far as I can tell, is absolutely an extraordinary novel that they have now made available to people like me, who would have had a difficult time reading it in the original Portuguese. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this event and to have the occasion to reflect once again on the many significant aspects of the translation process, especially today. I think this is all the more necessary today for a number of reasons, of which I will single out only two. First of all, the enormous progress in computer-based translations, which in this area, as in so many others, are increasingly encroaching into what was previously reserved for direct human intervention. This intervention does not disappear, of course, but it is being supplemented and to a certain extent supplanted by the machine-executed algorithms that inform computer translations. As with the game of chess and other games, the combinatorial power of computers is producing results that only a few years ago many would have thought impossible to attain, and the limit is nowhere in sight. The second factor related to this first has to do with the complex process of globalization, which at least ever since the end of the Cold War has been accompanied by a process of homogenization in many areas, not the least of which involves linguistic and cultural differences. There is a marked tendency today to downgrade the importance of such differences, which in turn produces a backlash that tries to absolutize these differences. In the United States, a recent and ominous manifestation of this tendency has been the decision taken by the president of the University of West Virginia, the so-called flagship university of that state, to eliminate entirely its teaching of foreign languages. It seems that for their students, it will henceforth be sufficient to rely entirely on Google translations to comprehend whatever texts are not in their native English or native language. For many purposes, this may be sufficient, as long as language is understood as a means of communicating meanings that are taken to be truly universal, which is to say, that taken to be the same everywhere and at all times, it may in fact not be necessary to have the experience of linguistic differences. But if there are significations which, as the product of signifying, I distinguish from meanings, if there are significations that are not simply self-identical or univocal, that is, not simply the same for everyone everywhere, this reduction of signifying to universal meanings taken to be universal, may lead to an impoverishment of perspectives, an impoverishment that can have dangerous and even self-destructive consequences. Translation as a process, perhaps even more than as a product, can entail precisely the affirmation of linguistic difference as cultural and historical difference. This clearly does not absolutize such differences, but presents them as an irreducible relationship, a relationship of incommensurability. There is perhaps no common measure that would entirely abolish the differences between the languages involved in a translation. And yet at the same time, there is communication of a sort, communication that preserves and articulates incommensurables. Just how this might work, I will try briefly to suggest by rereading with you a few lines from the translator's preface to the Bankruptcy. Cintia and Jason begin their preface by offering the following striking analogy, quote, "The writer is to the translator as the arranger is to the composer," end quote. This assertion is striking not just because it dares to explain a literary relationship by invoking a musical one. It is striking because it does so in a very singular way, one which, if read carefully, allows and encourages the reader to reflect on the very notion of parallelism itself. After all, in a simple parallelism, we might expect the sequence they are describing to be the same on both sides of the analogy. The writer is to the translator as the composer is to the arranger. This seems to reflect what I am calling the meaning of the phrase. But instead, something rather strange takes place. The sequence is reversed, for the writer is said to relate to the translator as the arranger does to the composer. This reversal of sequence, which disrupts the parallelism, is known in rhetoric as a chiasmus, from the Greek word chiasmos, which in turn meant marked with the Greek letter chi, X. From the 17th century on, the word took on the meaning in English of crossing. And since this was based originally on the form of the letter, the Greek letter chi, X, we could sum up the process of chiasmus by using a somewhat outmoded English expression, namely, X marks the spot. But if X marks the spot, what kind of a spot does it mark? It marks the spot of a crossing. But although originally this meaning, as I've said, goes back to the shape of the Greek letter, as a rhetorical figure, it is transformed. For it no longer designates simply a static shape or form, but rather a dynamic process, a sequence unfolding in time and space. So much for the chiasmus in general. But to return to the translator's preface, we are dealing here with a singular instance of chiasmus, and in particular with one that transforms or translates it. This seems related to what Cintia and Jason call, quote, translate, and they quoted this, translation's power to bend a language into new shapes, end quote. This is precisely what their chiasmus does. It does this, however, not in relating one language to another, but within a single language, namely English. This suggests that the process of translation may already be going on within individual languages and not just between them. If so, the word that describes this transformation for them, namely the word bend, is particularly significant since it describes an interlinguistic process that may be constitutive of language as such. Bend here not only designates the kind of crossing of one language with another, but rather it performs it in the use of what is considered to be a single language. In the process, it reveals that the singularity of language is never simply that of a self-identical closed system. The chiasmus here bends our expectation as readers and listeners of a simple parallelism supporting an analogy, and in so doing, the bend allows new significance to emerge. To be sure, the significance is then anything but clear or unambiguous. This lack of clarity and ambiguity is not, however, a deficiency to be corrected. It is rather an invitation to reflect on the possibility that the distinction being drawn here between writer and translator may not be as clear-cut as one might expect. For after all, is not a translator also a writer? And is not a writer perhaps also a translator? Surely not in the same way. And the difference between the two must not be ignored. Indeed, it is crucial. But the crux of that difference must perhaps be understood in terms of coexistence rather than in those of mutual exclusivity, either or. Perhaps what the writer and translator have in common is that they are both composers and both arrangers, albeit in different ways. The writer composes with and against the traditions of the language used, thereby rearranging them in ways that produce something new. The translator also composes, quite literally, with the text being translated, rearranging its sequences, bending and, quote, stretching its grammar and syntax into strange and novel forms, from the preface. But such bending and stretching can also be understood as a kind of composition, literally a placing together, not in order to absorb the differences between the old and new text, but to demonstrate how those differences work to produce significances beyond the explicit meaning of individual words and sentences. In his essay on the task of the translator, a title that is alluded to at the start of the second paragraph of the translator's preface, Walter Benjamin provides an unforgettable, if largely ignored, formulation of what he takes to be the primary task of the translator. And since his words apply uncannily, I believe, to the chiastic performance I've been discussing in the translator's preface, I will cite them here in lieu of a conclusion. Translation, Benjamin asserted, should strive for that transparency that derives from achieving what he in German called Wörtlichkeit in der Übertragung der Syntax, in English, literalness in the transmission of syntax. Syntax here is precisely not what is associated with grammar. Grammatical meaning is disrupted, indeed, if not destroyed, by such a verbatim transmission of syntax. But this is precisely what the translator's chiastic analogy also does. And I also will add, I think it's what they're reading, both Cynthia's of the Portuguese and Jason of the English, is also what they're reading for me demonstrated. What I'm calling here syntax could also be related to rhythm and so on. But this is precisely what the translator's chiastic analogy does. Like certain jokes, it incites and interrupts our expectation of meaning, and thereby opens the possibility that something truly significant might emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weber, for sharing this really fascinating insight about the role of the translator and his or her relationship to the text and the writer. So I am now delighted to introduce our final speaker, Abe Masahiko, who is a professor in the Graduate School of Humanities and Sociology and Faculty of Letters here at the University of Tokyo. He has written numerous books on British and American poetry and fiction, and he is also a translator himself, as he translated Frank O'Connor's short stories and Bernard Malamud's The Magic Barrel into Japanese. Furthermore, Dr. Abe is the recipient of the Waseda Literary Award and the Suntory Prize for Social Sciences and Humanities. So welcome, Dr. Abe, and I will hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Shannon, for your introduction. I'd like to thank Shannon and Professor Haneda and other members of the staff of Tokyo College for inviting me to this wonderful session. I'm not an expert on Brazilian literature, but I found the book Bankruptcy fascinating, and this proved to be an invaluable experience for me and to familiarize myself with the vibrant part of world literature. Now, here we go. Japan is known for its huge translation industry. We can trace the trend back to the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, when the country tried to deal with powerful foreign forces by modernizing its systems, such as education, the court, politics, military forces, etc. Translation was essential to the policy of the government then, for the adaptation of the Western models was crucial in the country's attempt to update its systems. Japan's fascination with overseas cultures, particularly the West, hasn't much changed since, except the brief period during the Pacific War when the government banned the use of the enemy's languages. However, the focal point had seen a significant change. Immediately after opening its border to the West, the Japanese were keen to absorb whatever knowledge available to them. What played a key role then was literacy. The priority of English education was on reading. Since the 1970s, however, increasing number of people started to argue that the country should shift its focus from passive reception to self-expression and active commitment. The idea was combined with the rise of so-called practical English which in the Japanese context led to the promotion of oral English as against reading and writing of the language. The main task given by teachers to the students in the classroom used to be reading comprehension and translation, but now their main task was speaking and conversation, even when their knowledge about the language is minimum. Communicative approach was the standard now. The ministry in charge of education told the teachers that they should speak only English in the classroom. There may be a point in such a systematic transformation, but I also believe that one shouldn't be too simplistic. What I'm particularly concerned is the demonization of reading and translation. Excessive emphasis on oral communication has brought about a decline of students' overall ability to read and understand written materials, which in fact is important not only in the business context, but in learning to understand other cultures. We also need to recognize the potential of the act of translation. The idea of translation covers a wide range of activity, since it involves, borrowing a phrase from Marshall McLuhan, rearticulating something encoded in one system by using a different code. This code can be likened to paradigms or systems, and it naturally includes language systems like English and Japanese. Linguistic translation is the initial crucial steps towards becoming proficient in the broader sense of translation, which facilitate us to adapt one system to another. This is arguably one of the biggest reasons why we learn foreign languages at various stages of education. Language translation is the starting point for various code transformations, including those involving scientific knowledge. Now, this is where my discussion is relevant to our topic today, that is, the translation of the novel. I forgot to share my PowerPoint slides, but here it is. Here are the topics I'm going to go through. I've just started and maybe I've reached halfway. Okay. And I show you quotation when I come to the text. Okay, so the rise of the novel is associated with many factors that were peculiar to modern society, such as individualism, print culture, silent reading, etc. But I also think it is important to pay attention to the development of transportation, not translation. Technology allowed us to travel more comfortably and more broadly, enabling us to cover wide areas and see and talk to people living in remote places. With the help of carriages, ships, railway, motor cars, and airplanes, we come across cultures we wouldn't get acquainted with otherwise. I'd like to argue that it is such encounters with foreign cultures that provides a driving force behind the novelist's urge to write. When one meets strangers from a distant background, one may be baffled, mystified, terrified even, on the one hand, but precisely because of this, one may be interested, fascinated, and attracted. Novels are often built on such a delicate balance between attraction and revulsion. The world of Bankruptcy is full of traveling too. What I'm particularly interested in is the way the characters get back to the basics. They walk. Let's look at one of these impressive scenes in chapter 4, where one of the main characters in the novel, Dr. Helvazio, walks out of the bar and explores the dilapidated area surrounding it. They went on walking in silence, and it was a completely new route for the doctor, who considered it interesting in its ugliness and extravagant in its conjunction of decrepitude and excess. The novel environment afforded him the pleasure of traveling. Filthy alleys steered up the hill. Houses with dirty walls mounted one another. Neither the grace of a curtain nor the bust of a woman appeared at the windows. Instead, worried faces, the brutal noise of heavy vehicles, and the thick heaving trunks of men with great muscles turned this corner of his city into an alien one, an infernal city, bestially preoccupied with bread. This is a typically novelistic scene of walking in which the person under focus comes across strangers one by one in an exotic environment. It is a kind of tour into the underworld for Dr. Gervasio. In this derelict area, everything is in decline. People are mired in poverty, depression, and madness prevail. But the doctor is fascinated, for the underworld attracts him by its strangeness. Even when his company is dragged into a dispute on the street, the doctor doesn't suspend his tour and carry on walking, driven by curiosities. I don't think I'll read this part because I'm running out of time. The panorama that unfolds in front of him initiates thoughts, ideas, and emotions within his mind. In this sense, walking forms part of his mental process. In the context of English literature, Charles Dickens, for instance, is one of the authors whose protagonists are known to be good travelers and walkers. For instance, in Bleak House, one of his representative novels, Esther is often led to encounter strangers and unknown objects. Her anxiety and curiosity are combined in this process of urban tour. Let's look at this quote. We drove slowly through the dirtiest and darkest streets that ever were seen in the world, I thought, and in such a distracting state of confusion that I wondered how the people kept their senses, until we passed into sudden quietude under an old gateway and drove on through a silent square until we came to an odd nook in a corner where there was an entrance up a steep, broad flight of stairs, like an entrance to a church. And there really was a churchyard outside under some cloisters, where I saw the gravestones from the staircase window. Esther's exploration is physical here, but this is followed by more clearly mental process. Everything was so strange, the stranger from its being night in the daytime, the candles burning with a white flame and looking raw and cold, that I read the words in the newspaper without knowing what they meant and found myself reading the same words repeatedly. I'll stop here. Here again, the character's physical activity is taken over by a mental process. Walking, traveling, and wandering begets anxiety, doubts, and curiosity. As is well known, Bleak House begins with an impressive display of fog. Fog everywhere, fog up the river, where it flows among green apes and meadows. Fog down the river, where it rose defiled among the tiers of shipping and waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights. Maybe I'll stop here. The fog here seems to hint at the mysteries that lie ahead. People walk through the fog, filled with anxiety and doubts, but the uncertainty motivates them to uncover the secrets too. Thus, walking often embodies the essence of novelistic representations of the world. As is commonly pointed out, the structure of detective fiction prevails in modern literature, with a narrative momentum driven by the quest for the concealed. While detectives in classic detective fiction typically remain in the room where the murder occurred, this doesn't necessarily mean that their investigation is static. Their minds are open to various contingencies that may arise within the confines of the space, such as suggestions, chance encounters, and accidental discoveries. This is how our minds walk, as it were, in the modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Abe, for finishing us off with this really interesting presentation. So again, I would like to thank all of our speakers here for their incredibly insightful and thought-provoking talks. I will now begin the discussion portion of the symposium and hear questions and comments from all of our panelists. Again, audience members, please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom screen. And our speakers will try to incorporate some of them into their conversation. And then if we have some extra time, I'll be able to read out some of those questions as well. So who would like to start us off for the discussion?
I can start, if that's all right. I was struck by several of the our panelists all discussed, even if only briefly and tangentially, the kind of the difficulties facing literary studies. On the one hand, there is the pros and translation. There is on the one hand the prospect of real-time universal translation, the technological prospect of real-time universal translation, which would seemingly do away with the need for translators altogether, and also do away with the experience of hearing unfamiliar words or ever leaving your linguistic your native language, and coupled with that, there is also the decline in reading as a pleasure activity, which I've just learned is sadly the case here in Japan, as well as in the United States and elsewhere. But there are other forms of culture which seem to be thriving. You know, we've seen how this novel, but perhaps the novel in general, you know, emerged and came to prominence in a time of urban renewal and urbanization, and I don't think those two things are necessarily unrelated. Whereas today, it seems visual culture and screen culture has come to the fore in our own moment, and I'm not sure what the material underpinnings of that or the reasons for that is, but it seems to be the case. If I can just start with an anecdote, I remember when I took my first world cinema class many years ago, I had to go to a very specialty shop like an hour away and fill in an order form to have DVDs sent, and then I had to go back and get them again. Whereas now my understanding is that even in the US, almost, you know, something like 30% of the content is not American content, it's international content that people are working on. So maybe we should start thinking about what translation means in screen culture. So I know we have some people who work on visual culture. So perhaps Maite and Vitor, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on what translation might look like in an age of visual culture. You know, does it look like Akira Kurosawa remaking King Lear in Sengoku period Japan? Does it look like simply, you know, hiring American actors to say lines delivered by, you know, non-American actors in this in a show that's otherwise completely the same? I'm thinking of the girl with the dragon tattoo, just one example that came to mind, where there's a Swedish version, I believe, and an American Hollywood version, and they're basically the same. They're both set in Stockholm, but in the one they speak Swedish and in the other they speak English. So yeah, I'm curious about given the kind of shift in the substrate and the medium in which we experience our narratives today. You know, what does translation look like in an age dominated by screens?
Shall I? I don't. It's quite curious, or not curious. We're discussing a lot the use of ChatGPT in universities at the moment, particularly with translation. And what do we do with that? I mean, I'm not a language teacher. We teach language through translation here, which is quite strange. But yeah, so I'm not part of those conversations, but it's being integrated actually within how we teach. It's not being kind of ignored because the students are using it. In terms of the, I mean, you mentioned the dragon tattoo film. I was thinking of The Leopard, in which Burt Lancaster had his, couldn't speak Italian, and so was dubbed completely, which is a weird thing of translation. I've actually just read, there's a chapter in a book that I'm organizing on a film by a Swedish filmmaker. It's an urban film, a film about Rio, and he made 2 different versions, a Swedish one and one for Brazil, completely different though, and translated them thinking about the audience that would be watching them. I mean, I don't know if that makes any, if that kind of, how we can kind of think of that, but it's this process of translating, in which, you know, the target language has to be considered, I guess. I'm not sure if your question means what do we do about the cinematic medium itself, as in translation, as in adaptation of texts, or...
Sure, I suppose, like, is adaptation, what is there daylight between adaptation and translation, or you know, what else might translation come to mean when you know, visual media is the primary media that we're talking about?
Yeah, I honestly don't know what translation would mean. Maybe Professor Weber, who spoke at length about translation, might be better with this.
I just wanted to pick up on Jason's question and related to Professor Abe's remark about oral and written language teaching. There's a practice very different depending on the culture and nation you're dealing with, that has foreign films primarily dubbed. For example, in Germany, there's an enormous tendency to have all foreign films dubbed, and in France, much greater tendency to have a subtitle. You see, and this is distributed differently, I think, depending on the country, the culture, the group that's being addressed. But for me, it's it links up with what I was saying about why I found your analogy with the composer compelling, because of the simultaneity that demonstrates the difference, both in the medium and the language. You have it can be troublesome sometimes if the subtitles are so rapid that you can't focus and so on. But I think it's a very salutary and important experience, because it would take a while to discuss that, but I think it's going on within languages as well. That's what I mean by trying to distinguish what I call significance from meaning, which is a somewhat not at all a general distinction that I make, however, because I think it's useful. So I just want to add that to because it seems to me that one of the most dangerous tendencies, obviously today, is what I refer to with the homogenization of globalization. It's been often discussed, but I mean, it's necessary. We're speaking all English here, more or less, but there are, I gather, Japanese interpreters and translations, and in any case, there will be a process of translation going on, even within English, much less between English and Japanese. But the question is, to what extent is that valued? To what extent is that encouraged? To what extent are the institutions there to support that? Or, as with the University of West Virginia, which here I think is symptomatic, is that going to be regarded as a superfluous expense, because language is there to communicate meanings that don't require linguistic difference in any sense?
I just wanted to add something here. Thank you, Jason, for your question. Well, I'm not an expert on translation studies, but as a literature teacher, I would say that when we consider those adaptations that you mentioned, right, from novels to audiovisual language, I believe that there is something that is crucial when translating or adapting a literary work that is, first of all, reading the novel, right, and interpreting the novel, right? And when we have another production based on a literary work, this production is already a manifestation of a reading of the novel. You see, so that's why, as I tried to put in my presentation, the importance of literature in schools, in classroom, not just in schools, but also in university. So the importance of reading literature and the importance of elaborating interpretive hypotheses. You see, so I think that's the starting point for any other production based on a novel. So I think that maybe that would be a way of thinking, of understanding how adaptations or translations, just like the one you did with Cintia, right? I think it passes through reading and interpreting the novel, first of all, something like this.
Well, I'd like to follow up Victor's positive stance, because I felt that the somber mood prevails now. But I'm quite optimistic about the future of translation, because I think basically people find it interesting to adapt one mode of thinking to another. For instance, they just like novels turned into films, films turned into novels, and if you just let people learn, well, if you provide the first step for students, they will learn how interesting it is to pick up and learn foreign languages. But because we are too focused on, as Professor Weaver said, on the reduction of language to meaning, we tend to forget how interesting it is to bridge different senses, different medium and different languages. I was just reminded of synesthesia when Professor Weaver was talking about the importance of incommensurability. You can, well, smell the sound, for instance, or you can hear the vision. And if you look at Japanese TV programs, you'll be surprised by the inundation of subtitles. We are very visually oriented culture. It's a different completely different culture from the culture of the West. So there are a lot of interesting things we can try. Okay.
I was also going to add on a positive note, since Maite mentioned ChatGPT and all these AI technologies that compete with human translators. In a sense, there is a positive element about it, which is to allow those who don't have access to translation to have at least a grasp on. I see students watching videos in my classes, Chinese students, and the video is in Portuguese. They have a translation app in their phone, and they can translate automatically. And they have the transcription in Chinese straight away. And I also see people who want to read more of Júlia Lopes de Almeida in my classes, and the Crônicas which haven't been translated. They just find a way to have access, a primary access to the text, which is fantastic. But of course, going back to what Jason said about the voice and the worldview and the way that someone particularly sees the world, for that type of detailed engagement with the text, we need a translator or translators who are very experienced and have a very good knowledge of the culture, the departing culture, Brazil, in order to convey that voice. Because what I see is that what Samuel Weber was saying, there is a tendency to homogenize, and that's what these tools do as well. So we do need this type of work, detailed, time-consuming, work of a translator in order to recover that voice that was for so long, silenced, and now finally can be conveyed, a voice that can be conveyed, a worldview, a way to see the world, to live the world, and that has to go through a manual, detailed, and careful translation.
I may also follow up by saying that I was just thinking about the Tokyo College's research theme, The World and Humanities in 2050, and we're surrounded by fascinating scholars and who are sharing the positive, or let's say the more careful relationship that we may have with technology or with the realities surrounding the video screens. So I just wanted to be more specific to all of you. How do you see your own discipline by 2050? In the sense, listening to or at least brainstorming the issues we're facing, the challenges in terms of teaching literature, or having a more general audience to really feel inspired to open a book, or even see what a reason to learn how to improve their writings instead of only the communication, meaning superficial use of language. If we can take the time right now to think about what would be this vision of 2050 in our own disciplines, and how can we feel inspired or even creative to think about other ways to be the change that we need in order to see the future of, in this case, humanities. And to add this, I was thinking specifically about Professor Weber and Professor Abe, who are translators themselves, and how the experience of being a translator changed your role as a professor, or even how you deal with your texts, your writing, how that possibility made you rethink your own classroom experience itself. Thank you.
Well, since you addressed it, since hello, Cynthia, nice to see you. I'll just say that it's very interesting, the relationship between the notion of world and language. And what I mean, I would say the most profound experience I've had in working in not just in languages, but in different areas where the languages are spoken, German, French, and English in particular, is to really see the incommensurability of the languages is also an incommensurability of the world, of worlds. You know, if we wanted a visual metaphor, it would be that the structures of language, not just the words, that's in a way almost, but the grammatical and syntactical organizing of relationships enormously determines the way one lives in the world and conceives of the world. And right now, in various cultural domains and political domains, there's a great deal of discussion about relationality, and often cultural difference is devalued as mere relativism, you know. And I think that's a very it's a very, very ominous characteristic. I'll just mention, because we're not speaking today in a vacuum, but in view of some of the really terrible and dangerous things that are happening right now in the world, I see that very much related to the question of how one, whether one can have distance from one's own convictions, one's own native language, and so on. And the inability to have that is, I think, a tremendous danger today. So, I mean, we're not just, I think, speaking about a rarefied academic problem, but we're speaking about one which has enormous and very important consequences for us all today. So.
Can I just share my view about the difficulty I face when I teach translation in the classroom, which may be relevant to what Professor